computer is picking up a strange signal. Here, sir, you better take a look at it.
Hi, and welcome to Sci-Fi Snacks. I'm Liz J. Bradley, a science fiction author and poet who adores short fiction and snacks. Each episode of Sci-Fi Snacks is a short and sweet, or salty, discussion of what I loved, what I learned, and what I snacked on while reading new-to-me short science fiction. As always, links to the short stories are in the show notes, so if you haven't read this week's story, head on over, pick up your favorite snack, and then join me as we discuss this week's story. Hello and welcome back to episode 23 of Sci-Fi Snacks. This week, we are headed back into the Solarpunk subgenre. It is clearly one of my favorites at this point. This is, I think, our third Solarpunk story of the season, which is a little less balanced than I would have liked from the start. I thought that I would do a different subgenre for each episode, but what I found was certain subgenres are much, much, much more popular than others, and Solarpunk is one of those. Now, what I love and what you'll come to see by the end of this podcast is that they are all very different stories while being in the same subgenre, and I think they explore different views of the world. Like, this story is very different from The Spiral Ranch, which was also very different from After the Rain, which were the other two Solarpunk stories that we talked about this season. So I think that there's definitely some value there. And I would also like to say that I think that if you read one story in a subgenre, it's not necessarily representative of the entire genre. So if at first it's not your cup of tea, the best thing about short stories is they're short. So you can try again. And maybe it was just something else with the story that you weren't vibing with. But also, I'm not your teacher, so you can read whatever you want. So this week's story is called Who Walks With You by Premi Mohammed, and this was published in Grist. It was another story from the Imagine 2200 series, Grist's climate fiction initiative, which celebrates stories that offer vivid, hope-filled, diverse visions of climate progress. I believe the last story that we read for this was actually Hope Punk from this series. So it's not just limited to one subgenre. People put their own flavor on it, but it is, that hopeful vision of climate progress as opposed to kind of a dystopian view. Now, this story was published last year, October of 2024, and it is just over a smidge over 5,000 words. Shout out to Premi Mohammed and her website, which was amazing and listed all of the short fiction she has published along with word count, which maybe doesn't matter to anyone else, but as a writer, I love knowing how long a story is based on the word count. It gives me a really good idea up front of how long it's going to take to read, what kind of story I'm in for, a 500 word story versus a 5,000 word story. Totally different experiences. And so I love that. It's very organized and it speaks to my type A brain. So that was awesome. I will link Premi's website in the show notes. Premi Mohammed is a Nebula, World Fantasy, Ignite, and Aurora award-winning Indo-Caribbean scientist and speculative fiction author based in Edmonton, Alberta. She has also been a finalist for the Hugo, Locus, British Fantasy, British Science Fiction, and Crawford Awards. In 2024, she was the Edmonton Public Library Writer-in-Residence. She is the author of Beneath the Rising series of novels, as well as several novellas. Her short fiction has appeared in many venues, and she can be found on her website at www.premimohammed.com. What a bio, right? Oh my gosh, that is goals. # author life goals. I don't have a great transition. I was trying to think of some sort of transition around goals, but hashtag goals. Want to talk about snack goals? How about a walking taco? That's a terrible transition, but I'm going to leave it in just for you guys. This week's snack was a walking taco. Now, if you do not know what a walking taco is, it is a taco you can walk around with. Now, I hear you. You're going to say, Liz, I can walk around with my taco normally. What makes a walking taco better for walking? And the reality is, I don't know. It is a little less messy. You know, if you're walking around with just a regular taco in like a hard shell, stuff could fall out unless you've got paper. I don't know. It really doesn't matter. But a walking taco is a taco salad made in the little snack-sized Doritos bags. And quite frankly, they are amazing. So you take a Doritos bag and you open it and you put in your ground beef and you put in your taco toppings, whatever you like, and then you kind of mash it up and you eat it with a fork. So it's taco salad in a bag. And I picked it because of the title, Who Walks With You? Muhammad asked, who walks with you? I responded, my taco. That's the level I'm on right now going into this story. So I've got my walking taco. You can make them at home, but I got mine from Cookout because weirdly it's on their menu. Why? I don't know, but I love it. So I settle in with my walking taco and I don't actually walk anywhere because I'm in the car. And I pull up the story and it starts out with our main character, Isolde, and she is waking up, which is an interesting choice we're going to talk about a little bit later. But she's waking up and we realize that there has been a crazy storm and she is in the bottom of this ravine of salt and she is surrounded, she's buried in this salt and the dirt and surrounded by the broken remains of her home and some robots and some, a drone. She is trying to figure out how to get out of this situation. And the basic arc of this story is it is a story about Isolde trying to get out of this ravine and all of the things that she will come up against to do this. We have her little drone type robot friend called Diff. And Diff is super cute and a little sassy for a robot, which she does talk about. I love that. There's definitely like characterization of this drone robot, and we find them working together, first of all, to figure out what happened. And through that, we find that Isolde lives in a future of America, and she's out on the plains, and basically climate change has affected the world in the fact that there are really crazy storms everywhere. And how people have responded to that is instead of hunkering down and picking a place that is like, oh, okay, well, this is safe. I know I picked Virginia to live in because I was like, the weather isn't super bad. We're not having snowstorms every year. We get the tail end of hurricanes, but we don't really have hurricanes. We've got tiny like dust devils sometimes, but we don't have tornadoes. And in the future here, there is no safe place. Everywhere has problems. And the reality is it's probably pretty close to what we're heading towards. So the way society has responded is by creating these moving villages. And this is something that they kind of harken back to how humans used to be more migratory. You would go in the summer to one place and then you would go in the winters to somewhere else where it was, better suited and things like that. But now we're migratory for different reasons. We're migratory because we are on the run from these superstorms. And the houses literally can walk. Now, I don't know if this is the right image. I'd have to go back and look at details. But you know how you read something and you're like, oh, this is the picture my brain has created? I see these little villages. They talk about them like tortoise shell houses almost, but with like bunches of legs coming out. And so I see this like the little droid pop-up thing from Star Wars that pops out of the sand and he's got kind of like a dome to him. And then he's got all these like weird little spider legs. I don't know what that droid is called. Someone will tell me. I know I'm not going to stop and look it up. But that was my thought, is a bunch of those like little domes with legs that can kind of move. And I thought that was just such a cool idea that we adapt our architecture to a sci-fi version of nomadic humanity. And I thought that was really cool. So we find out all of that through kind of the world building and the back and forth between Isolde and Diff as they are trying to unbury her house, which is smaller than most of the big ones. So most people live in really big ones because they're almost like intergenerational families living together because it's safer. The houses are bigger, they're stronger and heavier, so they can lock them down to the ground and the wind isn't going to blow them away. The problem here came in that Isolde lives by herself. She has never felt like a part of this society. She always feels kind of like out of gear with it. I thought it was a really interesting line in here. I'm not going to quote it directly, but essentially that there are always going to be people who feel like they're born in the wrong time. And I know that that's something that it's almost a meme, really, of women being like, oh, I was meant to be in a different time, and we're like idealizing the past and things like that. But in a weird way, I think it works in this story in like a non-ironic way, because Isolde is not idealizing the past. The things that are important to her are things that are privileges that we have at this time in our lives in society, where you can live alone. You can be independent. We have this mythos of rugged individualism in the United States, where that is kind of peak morality, peak goals of, I don't need anybody else, I've got me and I can pull myself up by the bootstraps. And like, yes, there are problems with that. But also, I feel like if there was any moment in history, in human history, where a person could, in fact, make it, quote, on their own without having to rely on other people, it's now. Is that ideal? No. Is that what I want? Heck no. I am a huge, like, give me my village, give me my community. I need all of those things. But I think that our character idealizing the past because it was a time where she could go out on her own and not have to live under her parents' wing and have her own apartment and do her own thing and be this independent person. Like, yeah, that makes sense. Like that, we have that option. You know, I was able to leave my small town and travel the world. I picked the right kind of job where they would pay me to go to different theaters and work. And so I got to do all of those things. And so I kind of resonated with that line in a weird sort of, time shifty way of, yeah, she wants what I want. But in this world, that doesn't work anymore. She has now found herself in a very perilous position where she could die. Her house is half buried. She doesn't know if she can get out of here. There's all sorts of technology problems of like, yes, the village is supposed to come out and look for her and look for anybody who was abandoned in this storm. But the way the signals work, she's too far down. And it's very likely that they will not be able to find her. So she has to pull herself up by her bootstraps and get herself out of this. And she's realizing kind of those consequences to this idealized lifestyle that she has convinced herself is the best way. And one of the things that I find really amazing in this story is that it's not just that layer, and we don't stop there. The whole story is just about her getting out of this hole in the ground. If you want plot, it's she wakes up in a hole, she figures out how to get out of the hole. But there's so much more to it. And then there's this layer of her sister and the story there. And we get little glimpses at the beginning that just kind of every time we peel the layer back and we get another mention of her sister, we realize why she is the way she is and how she has ended up here and so different in a society that has supposedly, overcome things and banded together and all of that. Why is she still on the outside? Well, we find out that a storm killed her sister, and that kind of broke something inside her because they were so bonded, they in the way that only sisters are. And there's this really beautiful part where it's a moment of overlap of, I feel like you could see it really, really well visually. Like if this were a short film, it would be that moment where we're getting flashes of what's going on in the present, mirroring exactly what has happened in the past. And she's trying to save the robot that was her sister's. And we're also getting these flashes of she tried to save her sister and she couldn't save her sister. And it was just, it was so gorgeous. And I can see it so well visually. Like I know exactly how you would film it. And I thought it was really clever how Muhammad could do that with words, because I think that's one of the really difficult things for a lot of writers, myself included, especially if you see things in your head. I think it's antiphasia is when you don't see pictures in your head, but like I very clearly see pictures in my head when I'm thinking of a story or when I'm reading a story. And when I go to write, a lot of the time I will literally close my eyes. I know how to touch type, so that's super helpful. And I will just kind of look around in my brain and describe what I see. And where you run into problems with that is that's a lot harder to do than you think, because I see it and my brain fills in all the details quite literally. And then translating those pictures into words is just really hard. And I think that Muhammad, that brings me to like what I loved about this story. She did such a good job on a line level of painting those pictures. You know, it talks at one point about when she's waking up that she sees all of these like white jagged teeth. She was like afraid she was going to be eaten, but then realizes like it's all pillars of salt. That is so evocative. That is so cool. If you have been writing any amount of time, you'll know that it is almost an auto reject if you start your story with your character waking up. And this is one of those stories that is the exception. Everybody thinks they're the exception, but this is one that really is, because it starts with those images that are just so evocative and visceral and like a beautiful painting of the situation our character finds herself in. So you can start your story with someone waking up, but if the next line is about how they're getting out of bed and they're rubbing their eyes and then they look at themselves in the mirror, like I'm bored. This, our character is waking up, but her world is completely different. It's completely shattered. It's changed. It's not boring at all. So that's the trick of it. And that's what I love, is that Muhammad can take something that's cliche and make it fresh and new and exciting, which was really awesome. What I also loved is the layering of the story. I talked about it a little earlier, that this is a story literally about somebody waking up at the bottom of a ravine and trying to get out of the ravine. At the very end, she gets out of the ravine. Spoilers. So in terms of plot, there's not a ton to it, right? You know, it's a very, very simple plot. But the story is so much more. It's about her sister. It's about her place in the world. It's about her relationship to her home. It's about the things in her home that connect her to the past and the relationship of the past with this future and the regrets of all of that tied in together. And so I just love that you can take a simple plot and make it a beautiful story. And I think that's something that I want to learn from. I think I lean into plot-heavy stories, and I always have, where it's like, okay, this happens, and this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and this causes this causes that. You know, you're figuring out the causation, and everything has to be really intricate and exciting at all times. And if the plot isn't exciting, it's not a good story. And that's not true. I want to look at my own work under this lens of, okay, plot and story are two different things. So I'm drafting a story this week for a writing competition. And I can't give away too much about it, but essentially I have the genre of heist. And a heist story the plot is pretty simple. It's very formulaic. There's usually a team and they're going in to steal something and it works or it doesn't. And so the plot is pretty simple. It's going to be the same. A lot of the stories that get submitted that will be judged against my story will have similar plots. What's going to make it stand out is how I handle the story around the plot. So I'm challenging myself to think, okay, the plot is they go in to steal the thing and then they succeed or they don't. But what is the story here? That's where we're going to find what makes it special. Is it a story about sisters? Is it a story about belonging? Is it a story about power systems? Is it a love story? I don't know yet. I'm playing with a lot of these ideas and I'm really trying to push myself to layer in, I only have 2,000 words for this. So I need to layer in an interesting story on top of a simple plot to achieve my goal. And so that's kind of what I'm going with. And I'm definitely going to look back at Premi Muhammad's story here to look on a line level. How did she do those things? Another thing that she did so well that I really want to go back, and I saw it while I was reading, but I feel like it's something that I can pick apart even more, is transitions and time jumps. Those are so hard to do. I think I still get stuck sometimes when I'm writing a scene and something boring has to happen. I get bogged down in explaining the boring thing or trying to make the boring thing interesting, when really you can just write that the boring thing happened and now we're on to something else. And readers will accept that and fill in the blanks. Like, we don't need to hear about it in the moment, in deep. It goes back to the misunderstanding of show, don't tell. People think that, show everything and you can't ever tell. No, tell the boring stuff. Move on so that we can then show the things that are interesting. I want the parts where I'm getting the connection with her sister and we're being shown all the different items in the house that are trashed and her connection to them. Those are interesting. Show those. But you can just tell me that they spent hours digging dirt out of the way and now they're ready to try and get out of the ravine again. Like, I don't need a painstaking play-by-play of every shovel of dirt. Nobody wants that. It's okay to skip it. You can just say, after hours of digging, they were ready to try again. It's kind of connected to that idea of showing versus telling, where there is this balance in science fiction. And I think this story did a really good job of balancing the science with the story. And one of the kind of pivotal moment here is that the batteries are dying and one of the anodes has broken and there's not enough power in the battery of the house for the house legs to pull itself out. But our main character comes to a realization that she's surrounded by salt and there's something in the chlorides, and she confers with her bot and then comes up with the plan that she's going to put chunks of the salt, I guess, into the battery to fix it and give it that little boost of power to get her to the top. Now, I am sure that there is science behind that because I was given just enough. And she did this brilliant thing where we had talked about it a little bit in another episode of hanging a lampshade on it. Like, if your reader's going to have a doubt about something, don't let them have that doubt alone. Point out that somebody else has that doubt. And so in this case, her drone, Diff, is like, hey, yeah. And she shuts him off because she's like, I know what he's going to say. It's possible, but not probable. And so she points out that this is a wild thing. And because it's fiction and because it's Solarpunk, in my brain, I'm like, we're safe. This is going to work. And it does. It doesn't work perfectly. It doesn't work great. She still, in the end, is going to need the help of her village But she gets high enough up so that her signal can be seen. And then she sees in the distance, she sees the village coming to save her because they have connected and things like that, which I thought was a really nice moment, that throughout all of it, in the end, she could get herself so far, but she could not get it over the finish line. There's only so much you can do. And that's the Solarpunk message right there, that the independence is good to a point. And we all have that innate drive for survival, and you have to be able to depend on yourself. But also, in the end, without the community, none of that matters, because she still couldn't succeed without them in the end. But what was really smart is in this story, we're given the glimpse of that, but we stop before they get there, because that's not what the story is about. That's the moral without hitting us on the head with the moral, because it's a story about her and her sister and working through her own grief and thoughts and feelings and realizing that she's cut herself off from community because of these things, but now community is more important than ever. And I really just thought that was beautiful. And now my connection to the snack is not nearly as beautiful as that thought, but what it is that a bag is like a ravine. And I was diving down into the ravine to get my taco. And so it was just this beautiful visual representation of all of this wonderful stuff being stuck down in the ravine, and I needed to dig it out. So yeah, super literary connection. Don't hate me. All right. Thank you all so much for listening again this week. I cannot wait to share next week's episode with you. I have no idea how long it will end up being. I have not recorded it yet, but next week we are going to talk about the novel Snow Crash as a special edition novel-length episode for our final episode of season 2. And you won't want to miss it. We will have an announcement about season 3 coming in 2026. Thanks again for listening, and have a wonderful week. Bye.